Shared it on my sites, like
Good
various.
program. And we're jumping
Should I
on
hit
to
okay? That's going to be
Yes,
videoed,
yeah.
right? It's videoed,
Go
right?
ahead. Yeah, we'll be recording this. Thanks for
Okay,
joining
good.
us, social media. Welcome to the program. Get the music started and let everybody into the. Good evening. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Greatest Generation Live for Thursday, June 26th. My name is Sean Hall. I'm the Director of Programming with the Veterans Breakfast Club. It's great to see you all here this evening. We see a lot of new names in the room today. It's great to have some new faces, some new names joining us. Welcome. For those of you who don't know us, we're the Veterans Breakfast Club, and our mission is to create communities of listening around veterans and their stories to connect, educate, heal, and inspire. And we invite you to check us out on our website, www.veteransbreakfastclub.org. On there, you can see all of our past programs, check our upcoming online and in-person schedule. You could check out our online magazine, which I'll get into a little bit later in the program. And we invite you to become a supporting member of the VBC, which helps us to keep the lights on, as we like to say. Our host this evening is Glenn Flickinger. Glenn, how are you doing?
I'm doing excellent, Sean. Thanks very much.
You look quite good in pink.
Well,
not many men can pull it off.
Yeah, I know.
Or is that salmon?
It's sand, actually. It's not quite pink. Yeah, I apologize to the audience for my extreme casualness, but I'm out in Columbus, Ohio for the past couple of days helping my son move, him and his family move from one house to another house in 90-plus-degree heat. So he just dropped me off about half an hour ago here at the hotel, and I am claiming parental abuse. I want my college tuition money back for 2 days of this. And I just neglected to bring my BBC attire. So my apologies, everybody.
Well,
yeah,
we'll definitely forgive you this evening, but we have a very special and interesting program lined up. One a little different than what we've been used to.
Yeah, very different. It's along the same lines of what we've been talking about really for the month of June, and that's been D-Day and the invasion of Normandy. Because tonight, the two men we're going to talk about are D-Day veterans, one from the 82nd Airborne who jumped in Normandy, and the other with the famous Big Red One, the 1st Division, that assaulted Omaha Beach on the morning of D-Day. And this man was with the 16th Regiment, which was the assault regiment. We have their two daughters on tonight. But let me just back up too, because I think we might have quite a few people who are maybe new to the VBC tonight. So every Thursday night, or almost every Thursday night, I have the privilege of hosting this program, Greatest Generation Live, basically all things World War II. And it's been fantastic and fun for the last 5 years for me. We've interviewed many an author, some famous authors and some not so famous authors. We've interviewed probably this year alone as 15 or 16 World War II vets, which is getting to be, harder and harder to find, but it's surprising how many keep, contacting us one way or another, or somebody contacts us and we're able to reach them and bring them on the program. So, World War II, Greatest Generation Live. So tonight, let me introduce our two guests, the daughters of these two men. Let me start with Carol Schultz Vento. Carol, please wave your hand, identify yourself. Tell us where you're coming from.
I'm coming from Palmyra, New Jersey, which is about a mile over the Delaware from Philadelphia.
Okay. And not too far away from you is our other guest, Susan Friedenberg. Susan, say hello to the audience, please.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming on. I live in Philadelphia, a block from where the Constitution was signed in Liberty Bell, the city of brotherly love with a lot of crime.
These two women are the daughters of the two men we're going to be talking about tonight. I think it's a fascinating story, not only about D-Day, but the rest of the war as well, but specifically honing in on the PTSD that both of them ended up suffering, but both in very different ways. And of course, in 1945, the term PTSD did not exist. And we're going to talk about that a little bit too, and what it was like for not just these two men, but all the men and a few women as well from World War II who came back home with no recognition, no understanding of what was then called combat fatigue, as well as some other terms, but that one. Let me also welcome, because I talked to him yesterday, I think it was, or maybe it was today. I've lost track of time. Rich Kensinger. Rich?
Hi, Glenn. Hi, everyone.
Rich,
We
Rich,
did talk earlier this morning.
was it today? Okay, I tell you,
Well, you're busy. I'm not so busy.
the last 48 hours are a blur, I want to tell you.
There you go.
But Rich is a member of the VBC. I think you're from Johnstown, Rich, is that right?
Oh, not Johnstown, Altoona.
Forgive me.
Altoona, the home of
Luckily-
the famous Horseshoe Curve.
Yep. Luckily, you can't hit me from there. But Rich has been a member for quite some time, and Rich has a long, deep background in diagnosing, treating, counseling PTSD.
Yeah.
So I called and asked him a specific question, and we're going to bring him in a little bit later in the discussion.
Yeah.
Because I think it is maybe the most important question to consider in this whole thing. Okay.
And I think, Glenn, we also should recognize our World War II veteran in the room, George Rubin.
Oh, great. George, is he unmuted?
I'll ask him to unmute.
Okay.
Yes, good to be with you, Glenn. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you. Yes, I reached out to George and asked if he could join us because many of you know George's story. Some of you do not. But to put it in a nutshell, George is a 100-year-old World War II veteran.
Wow.
Shot down in what month were you shot down, George?
February of 1945,
February of 45.
flying out of Sudbury, England.
Not only was he shot down, the plane actually crash landed, which I don't think that happened too many times. Most of the men, unfortunately, were shot out of the air, right? And George's story is fascinating. We're not going to go into all of George's story tonight because we've done that a couple of times before. But I invited George on because later in life, George began to understand he was suffering from PTSD. And his journey is very similar to Susan's father in terms of when the onset came and then how he dealt with it. So thank you, George, for being on. And we just ask you to comment now and then as we go through this discussion. Okay. Anybody else we should recognize before we get started on the PowerPoint that we've developed here?
We have Todd flying co-pilot this evening, so it's great to have
I was going to say
Executive Director Todd Bitestino.
we have a room full of VIPs here, and it would take all night to recognize each one of them. I love seeing this a room full of interesting and interested people like this to be part of this conversation.
Great. And Todd, thank you for being on. I unexpected surprise. We were watching for Zoom bombers. Instead, we got Todd. So we're good with that.
And I'll tell you why. Several years ago, before the pandemic, one of my neighbors came up to me and was interested in the Veterans Breakfast Club and interested in what we were doing. And I said, it's veterans sharing their stories. And she said that her father was a World War II veteran. And she said something like, have you ever covered intergenerational trauma? And I said, what's that? And she explained it to me. And it was new to me. It was a new concept to me. I didn't quite understand what she was saying, but oh my gosh, do I understand it now. And so I'm a latecomer, I think, to awareness about this issue being so prevalent in our population. Trauma does get passed down to generations. And I think I've just seen a lot of people really benefit from joining our programs because not that they saw war, but somebody in their family saw war.
Right.
Yeah.
Excuse me, I'm trying to use my hands from the PowerPoint, and I've been picking up boxes for 2 days straight now. And I notice my fingers are cramping. So I will make it through it though. So let's start with this. Okay, are we good?
Yeah.
People
I
seeing
can
that
see it.
okay? Okay.
Mhm.
So first of all, although we titled this PTSD in World War II, as I said earlier, there really was not. And if I need to find my how to advance this, give me a minute. There we go. Really, the term PTSD did not come along till, Carol, when? When did PTSD become a known term?
1980 in the DSM-3,
Okay.
basically after Vietnam.
Right, right. So these veterans come home from World War II. How some of them are suffering, as your father was clearly. How were they even treated? Was there any sort of support mechanism? Did the Veterans Administration come to recognize that many of these men were struggling in their post-war life?
Are you speaking to me, Glenn?
Yes, Carol, I'm asking you.
No. I was able, after my dad died, to get his VA files, and I know he had been trying to get disability payments for both his back injury and PTSD since 1946. He finally got it in 2003 when he was 80 years old.
Wow.
He got the back injury earlier, but for PTSD, he just kept getting denied. And I'd like to read a diagnosis from about 1965.
Please
The
go ahead.
veteran, is that okay?
Yes, please do.
The veteran has psychoneurosis, chronic anxiety reaction, extreme tenseness, self-pity with a low tolerance for frustration, inability to digest wartime experiences, recurrent depressive episodes with secondary alcoholism, and marginal social and poor economic and occupational adjustment, marked impairment.
And what year was that again, Carol?
64, 65. So they still were denying that the war had anything to do with it. It was basically the veteran's own fault that he had these issues. Inability to digest wartime experiences is like, okay, you're just blaming veterans who were looking for help.
Yeah. So let's get into the background story first before we get into their post-war experiences and their struggles, right? And the more I came to research, understand, talk with Carol and Susan about these two men, the more I realized this is a continuation of our D-Day series. Both men, as I said before, landed on D-Day. One with the 82nd Airborne as a paratrooper, Bernie as a medic with the 1st Division. So we're going to tell their war stories. And what's unique about these men, and there cannot be that many men who did this in World War II, they fought from D-Day to VE Day. They fought for the full 11-month period, and they made it through. Both were wounded, but not grievously, and both were pulled, were treated, but then put back on the line. And I'm sure if you could do the research, you probably couldn't find more than 1,000 men, maybe even in the hundreds of men who landed on D-Day and made it all the way to VE Day, particularly men like this in the front lines. We're not talking about supply officers. I mean, not to demean them in any way, but these were men who were on the front line every moment that they were in combat. Okay, so that's the story we're going to tell. Carol, you wrote these two books, Hidden Legacy of World War II first, and then second, Twisted Strands. Explain to us, particularly with the first book, what led you to write this book about your father?
Oh, well, a couple of things, and I don't think I mentioned it to you the other day, Glenn. I said to my dad in the early 2000s, another book had come out where he was included. He was included in a number of war books, starting with Cornelius Ryan, Stephen Ambrose, and a number of other authors. So I said to my dad, you know, Dad, other authors have written about you. I want to write about your war story. He said, well, you can write about my war story, but you have to do it from your point of view, and you have to include what you think the war did to me and to our family. And he sort of put me on that direction to sort of do a bit of an investigation as to why our family sort of suffered so much and whether it was common, because at that point I didn't think it was very common. I didn't think it happened that often. And I started doing pretty deep research. I started on the book. I started to interview my dad, and he started talking a lot more to me about what actually happened during the war, because he really didn't discuss that before. And he died before, the book didn't come out. This is the second edition. The first edition didn't come out until like 2011. So he had been gone about 6 years then. But I did a very deep dive. I was able to get his VA records. I was able to get material from Cornelius Ryan's archives, from the interviews that he did with my dad, like in the 50s. I was able to get the archives from Stephen Ambrose. So I was able to get a whole lot of information that I hadn't seen before, even though my dad had sent me, different things that he had sent to Stephen Ambrose. I was able to really get a load of information. And then I started doing a whole lot of research in old journals, that came out in the late 40s, early 50s about war trauma in the combat veteran.
So these books are, although they're the story of your father, they're also just as much your story and your family's story.
Not only that, I did so much research to show how common it was among those combat veterans.
And it's about the World War II, what we now know as PTSD. Yeah.
Right. And the treatments were basically, if you ended up in a VA hospital, the treatments were electric and insulin shock therapy, or lobotomies, which about 2,500 World War II veterans were lobotomized.
It's unbelievable to me. When I read that, I was shocked. But
me too, when I found that out through my research.
We're going to dive a little deeper into that in a little bit. So let me show people up back to how do I advance? Okay. Susan, this is your father's book, Bernie Friedenberg's book, published in what year was this originally published?
I think like 2006 or something, or
there you go. There it is. 2006. Yes.
Yeah, 2006. My father wrote this book. First of all, I just want to say that growing up, I never knew that my father was a hero. There were medals all over the walls. He never said a word about the war, ever. Right. And he never spoke of the war. I had no idea. And then finally, because of Doug Survey, who is on this, God bless you, Doug. He is a professor at Stockton University, and he was teaching at high schools and grade schools. And he got a hold of Daddy's book, and when it was a manuscript, and then he got my father to start talking to kids in high schools and colleges about the war. And what Doug would do is show Saving Private Ryan first. And then my father would walk in, and the kids would go crazy, crying, screaming, hugging my father. But I never knew my dad was a hero. And I actually, when the book came, thank God bless you, Doug Survey. And when my father wrote the book, I started to read it. And I got so freaked out. I was crying so hard, not knowing what he had been through. I sent Glenn the book. He knows there's some amazing stories in there. My father wasn't just like a medic that just took care of people and disappeared. He literally, right, Glenn, was like right there to save lives. Even a Nazi. Anyway, we'll talk about that later. But he was an amazing man. And I finally read the book yesterday and today, and I couldn't stop crying. I just cried. I just couldn't believe that this was who my dad really was. And I feel so bad that I didn't ask him questions, but he was starting to really go through his PTSD again. And I didn't want to trigger that when I read the first 50 pages.
The book is written in a very personal manner by Bernie, and it's just full of incredible, rich stories. And we're going to touch on 5 or 6 of them tonight, 4 or 5 of them, depending on how much time we have, because each of these stories illustrates just who the man was and what he went through.
And what I want to say too is that I'm putting in the chat my email.
Oh, yes.
And if anybody is interested in purchasing the book, which is an amazing book, and I've got, we weren't allowed to show Governor Corzine interviewing Daddy because there was a YouTube legal issue with that. As Sean knows, he tried hard. And I'm going to put my email in the chat. Please copy it and email me your email, and I will send you the most amazing CBS, ABC interviews when his monument was unveiled, which you'll learn about, and about just all about my dad and about the book. And I'm just so honored to have been Bernie's daughter. I can't believe what he went through.
Thank you, Susan. Okay.
Thank you. I'm going to put it in.
Please do. So a little background on both men and then their stories. Bernie, born in 1921, enlisted right after Pearl Harbor. And the interesting story number 1, is that he tried to enlist in the Army, the Navy, the Marines, turned down every time because of his eyesight. As you can see, he's wearing glasses. And at least at the very beginning of the war, the eyesight requirements were, very strict. So they kept turning him down, except one Army recruiter says, come back every once in a while because I think we're going to lighten up on these requirements. And sure enough, they did. And Bernie went back and was able to pass the eye exam and was admitted into the Army. So he was a man that really wanted to serve, and he did everything he could to serve at the very beginning. He's actually assigned to a kind of a hospital unit, as I understand it from his book, which really kind of at first disappointed him. And he had to work really hard, and we'll tell more of that story a little bit later, to get transferred to a combat unit. It took him the better part of the first 2 years of the war to make it to an actual combat unit as a medic. And of course, he's assigned to the famous 1st Infantry Division and even the more famous 16th Regiment, serves in everywhere that the 1st Infantry Division served. Bernie was there, particularly Normandy to VE Day as a medic. And then this is the little background on Dutch Schultz, Arthur Schultz. And Carol, when did he get the nickname Dutch? Was that in the Army or was that before because of the
He told me when he was a teenager, because I guess the gangster Dutch Schultz, and his name was Arthur. And he also was a Golden Gloves boxer when he was a teenager. And I guess it sounded cool.
Yeah, it's a little odd looking him up on the internet, because the first thing you get is everything about Arthur Dutch Schultz, the gangster. And
You have to put in paratrooper.
Yeah. Joins in 42. Eventually, he ends up in the 82nd Airborne, and he ends up as a replacement for the 82nd Airborne in Normandy, in England. He joins the 82nd Airborne in England in 1943 while they're training for the Normandy jump. And then, as I said before, he participates all the way through to the end of the war. Okay. He is lightly wounded in Normandy, basically a back injury, which maybe we'll get into that story right now. So many of you would be familiar with this map. I just used it to illustrate, excuse me, where the two U.S. Airborne Divisions landed. You see, this is Utah Beach right here, and the two Airborne Divisions landed behind Utah Beach, the 82nd closer in and the 101 further back. And the reason was they were trying to protect the flanks of you, if you will, of the men coming ashore, the 4th Division. Also trying to secure key bridges. Here's that famous city, not city, village of San Mariglis, where the 82nd Airborne and Dutch Schultz saw a lot of action. But Carol, like almost all or many of these paratroopers, your father does not land where he intended to land, and he lands and he's kind of all by himself at first.
Yeah, he was lost in the hedgerows till I guess daybreak. He probably landed maybe 2 a.m. or so, and he was lost till daybreak. And when he was, I'll go a little bit ahead, but when he was portrayed on The Longest Day, and when I read the book, I was just like a young teenager. And I'm thinking, okay, he was lost. Dad has a poor sense of direction. But I didn't see that he was involved in any real fighting. So it's sort of like confused me why, not that he ever talked about the war. I mean, he would make us march around, do the Huck 2, 3, 4, standard attention, all that. But he always made it seem more like fun. So The Longest Day just colored my thinking for years. And it's like, why does Dad have problems? I mean, his problems started really showing up, but by the time I was 15 or 16 when my parents divorced.
And for those of you who are fans of The Longest Day, both the book and then the movie, the book by Cornelius Ryan, this is one of the most famous scenes towards the very end of the movie. And this is the actor that played him, Richard Beymer. I don't know how familiar you are with Richard Beymer. Young man, obviously, at the time, but he famously portrays Arthur Dutch Schultz. And of course, this scene shows him with another, at that point, probably much more famous actor, Richard Burton. So did this scene actually occur, or was this made up by the movie makers, Carol?
It was made up.
Yeah. Now, the earlier scenes, which I don't have any shots of that I think, Carol, you told me you were accurate. For those of you Longest Day buffs, Dutch Schultz is the man who's on the troop ship and playing craps, playing dice, wins a lot of money. And then what happens, Carol? How's that scene play out?
Oh, my grandmother had sent rosaries, and she sent more than one rosary, but he supposedly opens the letter, the rosary falls out, and he feels guilty about wanting the money. He also thinks he'll be killed. And there was one of the other troopers said, yeah, remember you broke your leg at Fort Bragg? Well, he didn't even train at Fort Bragg, and he didn't break his leg. It was Fort Benning. But he sort of felt like a little bad, but he told me later, he said, there was a sergeant I couldn't stand who was winning, and I wanted to break him, and I went in and I lost the $2,500.
Wow.
Just some great scenes, famous scenes from The Longest Day for you Longest Day aficionados out there. So what's fascinating about Dutch Schultz is he is clearly a hero of the 82nd Airborne, but frankly, he was very similar to thousands of other men who served from D-Day to VE Day, or served in combat in Northern Europe. But he is singled out and made kind of more known by Cornelius Ryan, first in the book, then the movie, and then Stephen Ambrose.
Right.
So he becomes a well-known World War II figure, if you will, Carol. And at the same time that he is so well known, he is suffering from this PTSD.
Right, which really showed up, didn't show up right away, although I remember as a child, there was a bar across the street. We lived in Philadelphia. There was a bar across the street, and he would go over to the bar and he would get 2 quart bottles of beer in a brown paper bag. And during the evening, when he was Army counterintelligence at that point, he worked at the Frankfurt Arsenal. During the evening, he would just sort of sip the beer. He was not violent. I just thought, well, he's just drinking beer because he acted okay. You know, he gave us our baths and read us our books. But then my mom divorced him when I was 11, 12, and he really went deep into alcoholism then.
He also, just to complete his war story, he with the 82nd, he drops into Belgium with on Operation Market Garden. The 82nd. I'm sorry, Holland.
Yeah.
Holland. And the objective is the bridge at Nijmegen, which is right here, so famously shown, illustrated in the movie A Bridge Too Far. He's there. And Carol, there's an incident that occurs to him there with his captain that kind of illustrates how extreme his war experience was, and you believe was some of the basis for his PTSD.
Yeah, his company commander, Captain Anthony Stefanich, my dad adored him. And Captain Steph went to try to rescue some glider pilots that were being shot at. And as he went to try to rescue them, he got shot and killed. And my dad was there close by. And he said he went over and he was sobbing like hysterically when Captain Steph died. And he said that's the last time in combat that he cried, and he lost a lot of good friends after that. But he said if he didn't repress how his feelings of grief, he would never make it through the war. And I know he said later on in life that the fact that he repressed so much, basically, you know, I don't want to say it caused alcoholism, but it basically, he was self-medicating with alcohol because he wasn't talking about what was actually going on.
For these men in combat, of which we have many that are on the program tonight, having to suppress those emotions is kind of what you have to do in order to make it through. I would imagine someone who's never been in combat only interviewed a lot of people who have been. Yeah. So we follow through with the rest of his story. This is a picture of that's Dutch here with the helmet on. This was taken somewhere just after Operation Market Garden.
Somewhere in Holland, yeah.
Right. Sometimes you look at these pictures and you wonder, you know, these young men are all at war, all experiences, having these terrible experiences, and here they look like they just left a fraternity party, you know.
Right.
And of course, the 82nd Airborne is a key part of the Battle of the Bulge. And this is the map, the famous map of the Bulge. The 82nd Airborne plays a very important role right here along what's known as the northern shoulder of the Bulge in holding these German SS Panzer divisions from breaking through and forcing them further and further along in the Bulge.
Right.
Right. Did he any particular incidents or stories during the Battle of the Bulge, Carol?
Well, he talked about how they were rushed into the Bulge without any winter clothing, and how he had to basically cut a hole in his sleeping bag and wear that as a coat. And he also said, you know, you'd go in the foxhole at night and then you had to get out and you still had the sleeping bag on. He got pneumonia. I think he was in the hospital for maybe a week and a half. It's sometime in early January. And he said when he came back, more than half of his company was gone, either killed or wounded.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yep. Which is a very common story. Men that were pull off the line for an injury, or in your father's case, an illness, come back a few weeks later, and it's a whole different cast of characters that are there. Maybe just a handful of the same men he had served with previously. And these are just some pictures of the 82nd Airborne in action during the Bulge. These are specifically the 82nd Airborne. This is it early on in the Bulge, marching into its positions. You see pictures like this of the 101st, of course, as well. And then, the weather just turns dramatically worse.
Right.
And these men suffered as much from the weather conditions as they did from the actual battles. Okay. And then just one last picture of your father. Here, we think this is before he goes to Europe to join the 82nd.
Yeah, I think he was anti-aircraft in Norfolk.
Yeah.
And he volunteered to become a paratrooper. Sort of like Susan's father, you keep pushing to basically be in combat.
Yeah.
These men, and we'll get into Bernie's story here in just a second,
Mhm.
just felt that if they were going to serve, they were going to serve in combat.
Right.
And both of these men have that in common. They worked hard to get to that,
Right.
where they could have sat back and taken, less risky positions in, behind it. Okay. So, Arthur Dutch Schultz, D-Day to VE Day. I don't have any slides or pictures of him serving after the Bulge, but the 82nd obviously continues on throughout the rest of the war. Now we get to Susan's father. Okay. Bernie Friedenberg, as I mentioned before, 1st Infantry, 16th Regiment, joins the medical detachment and eventually becomes a medic. Susan, on the left is your father, obviously in uniform, but before
That's his picture from Fort Dix right before he left for war. And if you look at his face, it was so sweet and untethered, if you will. And then look at his face after 4.5 years of intense combat and saving lives. He was really freaked out when he got home. I mean, look at his face.
Yeah.
The horrors of war.
Right.
Yeah.
And my father in the book, he makes jokes about he tried so hard to get into combat, and they had him peeling potatoes, they had him driving generals. My father couldn't look at a potato for years when he got back. They had him doing all this weird stuff, and all he wanted to do was fight and be a medic. And I'm shocked that after everything he went through, that he didn't come home and become a doctor. But I think he had just seen so much blood. It was too much for him.
Yep.
And this is a map of the famous 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One in World War II, and one of the most storied divisions of the war. They come into North Africa. They land at Algiers here in November of 1942. They fight their way all the way through to the climax of the North African campaign in Tunisia in the spring of 1943. They then go on and make a second amphibious assault in Sicily in July of 1943 and fight there for 6 weeks in some of the most terrible battles of the Sicilian campaign. They are then withdrawn in the fall of 1943 and come back to England to train. They're chosen to be one of the assault divisions on Omaha Beach. Okay. So I think a lot of you know pretty much the story of the 1st Division. And as you can see, they fight all the way through the Northwest European campaign to the very end and end up in Czechoslovakia at the end of the war. And Bernie was with them most of the way, right? Here they are coming ashore in Algiers at North Africa. Bernie was not yet a medic with the 1st Infantry Division. This is the time frame when he's with this hospital detachment, but he's trying his hardest to get into combat with the 1st. This is a famous shot, actually. This is in a battle called Troina, up in the middle of Sicily, high up in the hills. 1st Division led by one of my favorite characters, terrible Terry Allen de la Mesa, and Theodore Roosevelt Jr. was the second in command. Both are relieved after Sicily because the First Division had an incredibly positive war record and combat record, but they also had an incredibly terrible record of fighting and brawling in the rear areas after the battle, which maybe you couldn't blame them, but Eisenhower and Bradley saw them as undisciplined, so that's why they, just an aside, they removed Terry Allen de la Mesa and Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt obviously goes on to be with the 4th Division at Utah Beach. De la Mesa comes back into the war later and plays another key role. But it's about that time, I'm sorry, I should have jumped here. It's about this time in Sicily that Bernie joins the 1st Infantry Division, 16th Regiment as a medic. Okay. And now we'll just jump to Omaha Beach. One of the classic pictures here. This is actually a picture of the 16th Regiment assaulting Omaha Beach. Bernie was in the 4th wave. And on this day, he earns the Silver Star. We're going to tell that story in a minute. Bernie would have come ashore somewhere in here. The 1st Division mostly was at Easy Red and Fox Green, the 29th Division on the other side of the beach. Bernie would have come ashore somewhere in here. Okay. Probably about, I would say, 8:30, 9 o'clock in the morning. This is not a picture of Bernie, but I think it's very representative of what it would have looked like if someone had been able to take a shot at Bernie. And who knows, maybe he's in the background there somewhere. These are the medics taking care of the wounded on Omaha Beach. I think we all know just how terrible it was at Omaha Beach that morning. And the medics, of course, are playing a key role in treating the wounded, evacuating the wounded, and they, as we all know from other wars, they expose themselves in order to take care of these men.
Yep.
Susan, in the morning at Omaha Beach, your father wins the Silver Star.
Yes, my father was in the 4th wave. He was only 120 pounds, by the way. And he jumped into the water. Everybody was throwing up because the weather was so bad. They gave him a big breakfast before they, jumped. But the boats were smashing into each other, the U-boats. Guys were getting their legs broken and drowning. I am just, no pun intended, I'm just blown away by this whole thing. And so Daddy, I always call my father Daddy. Daddy got onto the beach, and the very first thing on the shoreline was a minefield. And there were 5, he didn't know that there were 5, but there were 5 men in this minefield screaming in pain. And Daddy, he probed with a knife, and he crawled into the minefield at 120 pounds and pulled 5 men out on his back and gave them all first aid. And one guy, the last guy, got blown off Dad's back. Daddy had shrapnel in his head. He had a lot of concussions. His hearing was so screwed up after the war. And he should have gotten that honor. I always confuse the congressional or whatever. You know what it is, that the honor for such heroism. And his commanding officer said, well, you didn't wait for somebody to come in and really probe, and you didn't call us to tell us what was going on. And my father said, sir, there were bombs everywhere. These 5 guys were bleeding out. If I had left them in the minefield, they would have gone into shock and died. I couldn't wait for communication. I had to get them out. And he still never got that award. And may I just say, and I'm just going to be blunt and say it, the truth is Jews and Black soldiers did not get what they should have gotten in the war. And that's a fact. And I stand by that.
Well, and this was only one of many actions that your father had that morning. This is the one that was cited in his Silver Star citation, an incredibly brave act, but only one brave act among many that morning that he and the other medics performed. So just to go on, because I want to get to the PTSD part, The First Division fights also in the Battle of the Bulge, and they're right up here in this corner. They're also on the shoulder. I mean, at this point, sometime in mid to late December of 1944, these two men are no more than 7 or 8 miles apart, fighting in the Battle of the Bulge. The First Division plays this key role at, you see this little thing called Elsenborn here, and there's just some savage battles that took place along what's called the Elsenborn Ridge, where Bernie would have been serving with his regiment.
Yeah, he was at the Bulge.
Yes.
Obviously, he got shot at the Bulge, and a very interesting story was he was tending to this one man's wounds, and dad was trying to heal him up, and Dad said to him, "Your accent's familiar," and he said, "Well, I'm from Atlantic City." It turned out that this guy was from Atlantic City, and years later, they met up again in Atlantic City, and his wife hugged and thanked my father for giving her 50 years of a love affair and 2 sons. There's so many stories in that book, right, Glenn?
Well, and this is the next story I wanted to tell. This is actually the 1st Division, 16th Regiment, fighting through Aachen. If people understand the Battle of Aachen, famous German capital from medieval days, was terrible fighting in the city and around the city. This is about the same time as the Battle of Herken Forest and then the Bulge. And there's an incident in the book that when I read it, I had to read it several times. And I would think the way Bernie talks about it in the book, it's one of the incidents that leads to his PTSD. Susan, you want me to relate this or?
Please, because there were so many, I'm not sure. Is this the one about the little boy?
Yeah. So
okay, you read it.
So Bernie's in the aid station resting with a few other medics. A German mother or German woman, young German woman, comes in crying and wailing about her young son who's trapped in a building nearby and might be dying. Everybody else said, "No, don't go. It's a trap. That there'll be some Germans there that'll shoot you or whatever." Bernie says, "No, I'm going to go take a look at this." Goes with this woman. Of course, this woman is highly emotional at the time. He finds the boy, examines him, understands immediately he's in serious trouble, wraps him in a blanket, and with his mother took him back to the aid stations. He ran as fast as he could to the aid station, the mother trailing behind. When I got there, I quickly put the boy down and told Captain Davis, our medical officer, what had happened. Captain Davis puts a stethoscope to the boy's chest, turns to Bernie and shakes his head. And it's clear that the boy is dead. So the mother, of course, is wailing, and Bernie starts crying along with the mother. And, they wrapped the boy in the blanket, and they took both of them home. And then here's the key line in Bernie's book. To the present day, so this is when he's writing the book in the 90s, to the present day, I keep seeing that child and mother. This was one of the most heartbreaking incidents I ever witnessed. However sad it is that innocents must be suffer the deeds for the mad, power-hungry men in war. So, to me, it's just a very poignant moment in his experience, and he clearly, 40, 50 years later, is still remembering it and thinking about it. And Susan and I talking about it just believed that this had to be one of the incidents. And this is Bernie after the war, opens a bar in Atlantic City, and becomes after the bar becomes a motel owner and operator. And Susan, you want to tell us the story about how we got the loan?
Yes. Well, first of all, I just want to say one thing if I didn't already say it. I'm a little nervous through all of this, but I never knew my father was a hero. He never spoke of the war ever,
Right.
ever. All the medals were all over the walls. He never said a word until a brother took him to see Saving Private Ryan. And then my father flipped out in the movie theater, and Greg had to get him out of there. And he was a mess from seeing Saving
Yeah.
Private Ryan. And that's when the floodgates of hell opened for my father. But this is what happened. He came home from the war. He had obviously PTSD. My grandfather would take him on the boardwalk and take him for walks. If a plane flew overhead, my father would dive down and cover his head. And my father was really a mess. And he started to drink. But then my grandmother got freaked out by it, and then he stopped drinking completely. But then he would start going to bars in Atlantic City because there was nobody for him to talk to. He was so lonely. He had nobody to talk to about the war. So he would go to bars in Atlantic City because there would be other soldiers there that he could talk to because he had no one to talk to. And then he decided he wanted to open a bar. So my grandfather was very wealthy, and Daddy said to my grandfather, I want to open a bar. And my grandfather said, I'm going to give you the money. And Daddy said, I don't want the money. I'm doing this on my own. So my father went to First National Bank in Atlantic City and tried to get a loan. And they said, sorry, you have no collateral. And my father said, I just came back from fighting in the war. They said, sorry. So my father was pissed off, okay? My grandfather said, I'll give you the money, son. Daddy said, no, I'm going to do this on my own. So my father, being Bernie, here's my story. My father, Staff Sergeant Bernie Friedenberg, was a medic on Omaha Beach and fought and saved lives for 4.6 years in almost every campaign in Europe and came home from the war emotionally damaged. Nobody knew about PTSD then. He hid the horrors of war and never talked about it like most soldiers that come home from war. He chilled out for several months and wanted to open a bar in Atlantic City, where he was from. His beloved dad, Jake Friedenberg, had a lot of money and told my father he would give him the money to open a bar. Daddy wanted to open it on Mississippi Avenue. My grandfather said he would give him the money. Daddy said no. Daddy went to First National Bank, asked for a loan. I just told you that they refused him. My father would not let my grandfather help him. He was proud. My father gathered all of his medals, 2 Purple Hearts, 2 Silver Stars, 2 bronze medals, and went to the mayor of Atlantic City's office, Mayor Altman. He walked in with his military paperwork and all his medals. The secretary said, what are you doing here? And do you have an appointment to see the mayor? And Dad said, no, and walked right past her and went right into the mayor's office. The mayor stood up and, the mayor looked up and said, who are you? Dad responded, I am Staff Sergeant Bernie Friedenberg. I was raised in Atlantic City. I left for war, 4.6 years of fighting. And here are all my medals. And Daddy put all the medals on the mayor's desk. He placed them on the desk and he said, Mr. Mayor, I need a loan. And First National Bank will not give me one because I don't have collateral. I need you, Mr. Mayor, to co-sign a loan for me. The mayor stood up. He shook my father's hand, thanked him for his service, and said, let's go, Sergeant. And off they went to the First National Bank, and my father got the loan he needed. The rest is Atlantic City history. Daddy opened the Dusty Roads Bar. It was around the corner from the famed 500 Club. Later, he bought the Pencrest Hotel on Pennsylvania Avenue, green on the Monopoly board. Then the Fiesta Motel, orange on the Monopoly board on Tennessee Avenue. After he sold that, he was a realtor on the island. Mayor Altman made it possible for my father to become a successful businessman and make a difference in the Atlantic City community. And when we talk about my father's monument, which Glenn will talk about.
We'll get to, yeah.
Okay, the mayor of Atlantic City gave us $460,000 towards that.
Yeah, and it's beautiful. We'll cover that.
Yeah.
Bernie comes back from the war, can't get a loan, marches into the mayor's office, says, I demand a loan. And the mayor marches down to the bank with him and basically helps him secure the loan. So it's a great story about that. So let's pause here. We've taken up the first 45 minutes or more, and we want to get into their post-war situation. But are there questions, Sean? Are there comments from the chat room that we should address?
No, everything's let's see here. Everything's been lively in the thank you, Rich, for the comments. Let's see. I think James asked. I was one Medal of Honor was to be awarded per division for D-Day and months afterwards. Does anyone know? And Bobble said he's heard that as well regarding the Medal of Honors on D-Day.
So there was this discussion among the military high command about how many medals should be awarded for D-Day. And there were several men, Bernie among them probably, that deserved the Medal of Honor. But it was limited to, I don't know if it was one per division, but it was limited to a very few men for D-Day and the days afterwards. I can't remember off the top of my head how many, but 3 or 4 at the most. And it was exactly as you stated, Sean, limited for whatever reasoning. It's hard to understand what reasoning that would make any logical sense to us today. But at the time, that did happen.
The question in the chat. Let me flip over to the gallery view here. If anybody has any questions. Yes, Rick Weber. Let me ask you to unmute, Rick. Hold on, Rick. Can't hear you. Got to unmute.
Okay.
There you go.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay. It is very difficult. Anyone who gets a silver star, the next one is higher than that. Anyone that gets that, and especially listed, they've earned it. The difficulty is you have to fill out so much paperwork, and it has to go from an officer, and in this case, to the first sergeant. And a lot of old first sergeants don't want to do the paperwork. And that's where it really becomes, unless it's really unbelievable in the whole unit. You look at them, you look at these Medal of Honor winners, and there's probably a lot more that should have received them that didn't. But in my experience, what I saw, it didn't make any difference because the people were there wrote it. And if there was enough, but the difficulty is there's so many heroes, it is difficult to give them all. And most of these gentlemen are not looking for medals. They're doing their job, and by doing their job, they put themselves in harm's way. And I have the highest regard. My favorite people are medics. They are, and they will always be, because they were heroes. They risked their lives almost every mission. So with that being said, though, but getting people medals is very difficult. And I'm sure it was same as World War II. You had a lot more people, a lot more action. You had to be Audie Murphy to get a Medal of Honor. So that's all I wanted to say.
Thank you, Rich.
Any other hands raised? I'm looking around the room.
Well, I just want to break in and say we have another World War II veteran in the room, Russell Friedenberg. Russell has joined us before. He was, I believe, in the 8th Armored Division and Battle of the Bulge. So would certainly be interested to hear Russell and George Rubin chime in with comments about what they've heard so far.
Russell or George, any comments so far?
George, I'll ask you to unmute, and Russell, I'll ask you to unmute.
Mute. I'm unmuted now.
Yep, we can hear you, Russell.
2 things. I just came on. I've been to a potluck dinner here in northern Michigan. Are you interested in an actual battle, not a battle, but the actual World War II incident that I was involved in? We had cleared out the town and set up a perimeter for the night. And I picked out a pretty large house, and I was walking to the house with another soldier in our unit. And all of a sudden he stopped and looked at me, and he said, "I don't want to do this anymore." And he started to cry, and his body started to shake. And I called a medic up, and the medic led him away. And that's the last I ever heard of him. But I did actually see this and take part in it. And it was rather an emotional scene for both of us. And after the war, very few people talked about World War II with veterans when they came
Right.
home.
That's right.
Right. As my dad said.
Yep.
Well, Russell, thank you for sharing that with us. And you know, I think the research has shown that men, whether it's World War or men in combat, World War I, II, Civil War, Vietnam, you name the war, can only tolerate so many days
That's
of
right.
this kind of severe combat
That's
conditions.
correct.
Some, and we're going to get Rich and Carol to talk about this in a minute, some seem to be able to stand it longer than others. Some men suffer dramatically from the events that they participated in. Others seem to shrug it off. And that's the kind of the question I want to get into here in the remaining part of the program. So thank you so much, Russell. Let us get into this second half of the program. And please, Russell and George particularly, we'd love your comments.
Yeah.
Sean, do we need to take a station break?
Sure thing. I can do that real quick so that we can get right back to it. Just want to sponsor this evening UPMC for Life. They have programs made by veterans for veterans. If you'd like to check out and see how they can put some money back in your pocket, check them out at upmchealthplan.com/Medicare. We want to thank them for supporting the Veterans Breakfast Club. This is going to be our next summer issue of the VBC magazine. This goes out free quarterly to anybody that we have your address. If you don't get it, because we don't have it. So please send that to myself or Todd, your address, and we'll get it to you in the mail. And you'll continue to receive it as we print these up. This will be honoring the 80th anniversary of VJ Day. Upcoming on Monday, military contractors. We've not done a program like this before, so we've been trying to get the word out to anybody who may know a military contractor. Please reach out to anyone that is in your network and invite them to come on. We'd like to hear their story. It's going to be a very interesting program, and hopefully we'll have some military contractors in the room that will be able to share their experiences. That'll be Monday night, July 1st, back at Bethel Park for our in-person breakfast. Looking forward to this. This is always a great crowd. If you have not joined us for an in-person breakfast and you're in the Pittsburgh area, please come out. It's the same great program that we have here, except we get to do it live in front of everybody. It's a lot of fun. Todd and I usually split the room and have a great time. And we have a special morning program of GGL coming up on July 2nd, 9 a.m. Glenn, do you want to give us any preview of that?
Sure. This is through our great friend, Scott Masters. I imagine Scott is on the program tonight. Scott, thank you for bringing this to us. This is with British historian Tim Saunders, who's also a retired British military and an expert on Gold Beach on D-Day. We decided we'd like to do this program, and I believe we're going to have a Gold Beach veteran on, a Brit. I think that's in the works, as I recall. And the thought here is, you know, we talk about D-Day, we talk about the Battle of Normandy, almost always from the American point of view. And we forget that actually a majority of the men who landed on D-Day and fought on D-Day were our allies, either Canadian or British, and a few French as well. So we want to honor their role as well. And that's the idea behind the program.
So note that 9 a.m. on July 2nd. Join us for coffee and GGL. Back to you, Glenn.
Thank you. Okay, I want to jump into, and perhaps I spent a little bit too much time sort of setting this up, if you will, but the men come home. There's lots and lots of pictures of the men coming home. And Carol, as we said before, these guys all look happy as can be, of course. They're home, they made it through the war. But you've written in your book that through your research, you estimated that as many as a third of them at the time they came home from the war were suffering from battle fatigue, war trauma, what becomes known as PTSD.
Right.
Who wrote that figure? How was that? Was that arrived at?
I think I got that from the National Center for PTSD, and I'm trying to remember the name. I had a phone conversation with the director. I can't remember his name right now, because it was so many years ago, but he told me that figure.
And as we said early on, there's no support mechanism set up for them. There's no recognition that some of these men are suffering. So it's all, they deal with it in their own ways.
Mhm.
And some of the statistics which you quoted in your book to me are just amazing. The divorce rate in 1946 and 47 was what?
1 in 4 or 1 in 4.5. Wasn't 1946 was the high point, and it wasn't matched again until after the Vietnam War, like 1974. So the early divorce rate was pretty high, which was never really an area that was discussed, or I didn't know it until I started doing research. And really, my parents probably would have gotten divorced early on. My mom was daughter of an Italian immigrant. My dad came, he was from Michigan. He came up to Philadelphia on leave with a buddy, met my mom. They rode through the war, came back and married her 2 weeks later. She said from the time that they got married, he was having horrible, horrible nightmares. He would wake up in the middle of the night, run to the window, say, "Here they are, here they are, here they come."
Yep.
He would have such horrible night sweats. She said her nightgown was soaked. They went out to California where his parents were then living. And my mom wanted to go back to Philadelphia. He wanted to stay in California. He had started at San Francisco State, was playing ball there. My mom came back to Philadelphia. She found out she was pregnant with me. And then she wrote my father and told him, and he decided to join her. So I always feel like, oh no, it was because of me that they stayed together for like 12, 13 years. But yeah, the divorce rate was very high right after the war. And my parents might have joined that number if it hadn't been for me.
Yeah. And obviously the focus is on your father here, but there are literally tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of men going through this same experience.
Right.
And if they went to the VA for any help, what sort of help might they receive? Anything?
No.
Nothing. Your father, as you described it in the book, becomes a high-functioning alcoholic. And finally, in 1964, and I know this is a very personal story, but you've told it to me and it's in your book, he attempts suicide. And you actually, as a young teenager, I think maybe in college at the time,
I was about 16.
16,
Mhm.
you talk him out of it.
Yeah, he was married for the second time to a woman that he met in one of the alcohol rehab centers. And they were both alcoholics. He had known her for 2 weeks. He ended up marrying her. And he called one night and he was, I guess, looking for my mother. My mother was out. I answered the phone and he was very drunk. He was sobbing. He said Ardell, his wife, had slit her wrist and she was bleeding in the bathtub. And then he said that he was going to join her, like he didn't want to live anymore. He had missed the boat. He had been a horrible father. And I just tried to talk him down and say, "No, Dad, you were a good father." And, and from what I remember, I hung up. My mom came in just about 5 minutes later. She called and he answered. And I think she told him to call the police for Ardell, and they took her to the hospital. And then she was in the state mental hospital for about 3 months. She also called, my mom called his paratrooper buddy, who he also was in Army counterintelligence with him at the Arsenal. and he went down to get my father. And Joe told me after my father died that the place was a shambles, that, like broken furniture and blood. And he put my father on a plane out to California to his parents. And my dad at that point was about 40. So he basically had lost everything.
But this ends up being sort of a turnaround point for your father in
Right.
that he, after this, becomes sober for the rest of his life.
Right. He was in California for about 3 years, and his wife eventually did join him, and they both went to AA meetings every night, from what he told me. And they both were sober and came back to Pennsylvania, and were working at a place called Eagleville Hospital, which was for drug and alcohol patients. And my dad was at the head of the men's program there. He had gotten a college degree while he was out in California, came back to Philadelphia, got a master's of psychology from Temple. He worked in he was a director of a number of drug and alcohol programs. His last job in Fort Irwin, California, was head of the Drug and Alcohol Center, counseling veterans.
Probably mostly Vietnam veterans at that time.
I think probably mostly Vietnam, yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So your father really sort of turns his life around. I mean,
Right.
earns a master's in psychology.
Right.
Do you think he was still suffering?
Oh, yeah. He married for a third time. But yeah, that marriage was pretty good for a while, but then he started having a lot of issues as he got sicker and sicker, and she got more and more upset with him. So yeah, he lived in California. I was, in the Philadelphia area, but I would go out every summer with my daughter from the time she was 3. And he started talking more about the war then, and talking more about what he went through, and, basically talking more honestly.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
that's when you begin to form the idea of writing this book.
Yeah.
So let's jump to Bernie's post-war experience. You mentioned it earlier, Susan. For the most part, you did not observe any PTSD in your father, but it's triggered by your brother taking him to see the Saving Private Ryan movie and that horrible, but very realistic first 18 or 20 minutes.
Yeah, my father, Tom Hanks, was my father. And, that's when the floodgates opened, and my father started having horrible nightmares. And oh, there's my daddy. What helped save my dad was Doug Servey. I keep mentioning Doug. He's so cool. I know he's on with his wife, Kelly. But Doug got Daddy to start talking about the war. And then my father joined the Jewish war vets post 39. And that really helped Daddy to, help other veterans and raise money for the Violent Veterans Home. But we had to separate. When that movie came out, my parents were happily married for 70 years until my dad died first. And I just want to say that the way they met, it was so cute. My mother was an amazing singer. She could really sing. And the hotels in Atlantic City were converted into Army hospitals.
Right.
And my mother would go and sing to the troops. And after one of her singing engagements, if you will, she and her friend Ethel Cohen, it was a setup. My mother had no idea that Ethel and her boyfriend, Jackie Cohen, who was Daddy's best friend growing up, had made a thing to fix them up. And they went to this bar. It was love at first sight. And they fell in love. But when Daddy started to have, years later, all of his PTSD, he'd flip out at night in bed, screaming commands, try to jump out of the bed. And Daddy kicked to mom one night, and he started crying, and he said, I can't sleep with mom anymore. He said, I'm going to hurt her. I don't want to hurt her. So mom went into my bedroom. I wasn't living there anymore, and she would sleep in my bedroom. And I just want to tell you one thing really quick. I was flying. I'm a flight attendant. I was flying private jets, and I had Norman Schwarzkopf on a flight. And Norman said to me, he said, it's a whole story, but he said, tell me about yourself. And he said, my wife was a stewardess. She sang to me in Vietnam when I was shot. He said, tell me about yourself. And I said, well, I would rather tell you about my dad. So I told Norman, and he is big. He was big. I was this little person. He said, tell me about your dad. And I told him about Daddy. He goes, this airplane has a phone. I said, yeah. He called Daddy. And they were on the phone for about 45 minutes.
That must have been special for your father, yeah?
Oh, yeah. Mommy came home from playing mahjong, and Daddy had on a Jack Daniels hat, and he was taking a couple shots at Jack Daniels. It was in the Atlantic City Press that Norman. And then I flew him a year later with Eli Lilly. And when he saw me, he went, Susan, how's Bernie? Do you believe that?
So let me bring George Rubin into this. George, are you still unmuted? I don't see him on the screen. Sean, do you?
He is. George,
I
I'll ask
see
you to
him.
unmute. There you go.
Thank you. So, George, it struck me that Bernie's story is a lot like yours. Bernie, as I would try to express it, suppressed his PTSD when he came home from the war,
Correct.
became a very busy local businessman, and not until the 90s, and he had retired, I think, by that point, it's triggered by, of all things, going to see the movie Saving Private Ryan.
Yep.
And George, in your case, you did not begin to suffer PTSD until when?
Okay, let me go back first. And all of the stories you've heard, these wonderful guys all fought on the ground. The Air Force was a different war, and we fought in a different way than you guys, getting up in the morning, having a good breakfast, and then taking off on a mission for 7 hours or more. And the enemy we fought were machine guns from enemy aircraft coming at you, and flak. So we were, and you're all alone. You don't have the comradeship within a bomber that you have when these guys fought in a squad or a company together. And so you would come home after the mission was over, maybe shut up a little, and you would receive a couple of shots of scotch and a peanut butter sandwich. This is why I find so many guys are alcoholics later on. 18-year-old after 7 hours in the air, having no food at all and getting a double jig of scotch on the ground was something fairly new. Now, as far as PTSD, when you came home, we were told, forget the war, go back to work, go to college, go on. And you'd look for guys who were wearing a ruptured duck. I think many of you remember we had a little eagle we put on our civilian clothes so you knew another guy was a veteran. You don't see that today. And we forgot all this and let all of these things simmer. If you fast forward for me, and I won't go into the story of my marriage or going into professional career, but if you fast forward into the 1990s, I'm beginning to think about retirement, and I'm also having horrible night terrors. As a matter of fact, my wife would find herself at sometimes black and blue because I was fighting an unknown enemy at night. I had no idea what was going on until she said to me, George, you got to do something about this. You're in terrible shape. And so for the first time, the very first time, I took myself to a VA hospital. I had never been in one. I didn't think about it coming home from the war. And when I walked in, they said to me, where the hell have you been? You guys of World War II just seem to forget about it and don't know how you're suffering. And that started me on a course of understanding through psychiatry and psychological care of the PTS clinics, first in New York and now here in Philadelphia, what I needed to learn about myself and what I had suffered and what I was suppressing all these years.
Right.
And so even to this very day, I meet every Friday with a group of veterans. I'm the grandpa. Most of the guys come from either the Vietnam War or from Iraq or Afghanistan. We meet with a psychologist. All of these guys have suffered horribly, and we learn about ourselves and how to live with it. Not that it's ever going to go away, but we learn how to cope
That's
with
right.
it and handle
That's
it.
right.
And
That's right.
so that's where I am today.
Thank you, George. Thank you.
I just want to say that the psychiatrists in Wilmington, Delaware at the Veterans Hospital were the ones that told my father, because he was flipping out, that he needed to write a book or write it to document and to kind of purge everything that had happened to him. And that
That's right.
writing that book really helped
Thank you.
Mr.
Yep.
Kensinger.
Let me ask Russell Friedenberg to unmute again. I just asked you, Russell. So, Russell, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear.
Okay. So, Russell, when you came back from World War II, do you believe you were suffering in any way from war trauma? What did the higher ups, let's say your officers, your leaders, tell you about how you were supposed to feel coming back home? Or was there nothing said?
Nothing was said. And when I got back home, by and large, the people never talked about the war to
Right.
me, never asked about experiences and so
Right.
on. And I think the GI Bill was one of the greatest pieces of legislation
Yes.
ever. And it gave the veteran a chance to go to college.
Yep.
He had a new challenge with his studies, and the atmosphere was very different than if you went back to your old job. It was a new experience, and I think that saved a lot of soldiers
You're right.
from some of the cases here that we've talked about tonight.
Well, Russell, that's a great segue into really the key question I want to discuss tonight. And it comes from Carol's book. And I won't look for the exact quote, but I remember when I read it, I circled it, and then I went back and put a star, and here it is. I put one of my yellow stickies and said, "Great question." And it says this: but there remained the constant nagging thought. This is Carol speaking. Why did my father react so strongly to war trauma, become an alcoholic for part of his life, with war memories bringing him to the brink of suicide? Why were other families of combat veterans relatively stable while ours was destroyed? So I just was stunned as I thought about that. And I spoke with Rich Kensinger. Rich, I know you're unmuted. And Carol, you have this whole book is basically then answering that question.
The second, yeah.
The second book, yeah. So, Rich, you've been on our program many times in the past.
Yes.
We
Yes.
know you have this professional career in diagnosing, working.
Well,
with-
I'm a licensed clinical psychologist. Now,
Right.
I am retired, but I'm still licensed to practice within Pennsylvania.
So I'm going to pose the question again and ask Carol and Paul or Rich and anybody else in the audience. Not all men came back from World War II or any war. World War II, Vietnam, World War I,
Any war.
Korea, any war. It's all
Any war.
relative to this discussion. It's all more or less the same.
Yes.
Not all men came back and suffered from the extreme conditions of PTSD. Carol's father did. Susan's father eventually did. George Rubin eventually did, right? But there were many men who came back and sort of shrugged their shoulders and seemed to make their way through life without the struggles that we've just talked about.
Okay.
Why is that? Or is that not true? I mean, why is it that some men and women who've been in combat seem to be able to deal with it better than others?
I've done consultations at no charge with people from Korea. I really haven't interviewed anybody from World War II. Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan. They're all scarred in complex ways. When we're talking about PTSD, we're really talking about what we refer to now as complex, because they have these repeated horrible, horrible experiences. And there's no way that they're going to bring that home and externalize it to the family, because it's what I refer to. And just by the way, free of charge, I do lots of clinical research on combat trauma. If you want any of my articles, I think in fairness, it would give you a little bit better insight to this most important questions. I haven't seen anybody who's normal after going through all these conflicts.
No, you're so
It
right.
may be just it might
right.
be a kind of a degree of, all right? But like some of you were saying, if you can get vets to get what I find to be the most effective intervention, and you don't have to have a psychologist running a group, but group therapy is so uplifting. That works. But we're talking about complex disorders, complex PTSD, TBI that affects not just the brain, but the cardiopulmonary systems. We're talking about very serious moral injuries, right? Alcoholism, which unfortunately is highly associated with completed suicide, particularly among males. So this is a very valid and really interesting topic. What I'm willing to do is share all my research to anybody who's interested. What I'm willing to do with Carol and it's Susan is consultation. I've put my email address. I'll send you articles. Anybody who's interested, I'll send you articles. But with these two, I'd like I'd like to do consultations. I have an obligation to do what I do, confidentiality.
Thank you.
You're
Carol,
welcome.
Carol,
It's R, so it's small, it's lowercase. R Kinzinger 70 at gmail.com. I have
Can you put it in the
hundreds
chat?
of articles.
He-
So
it's-
it's RKENSINGER 70 at Gmail. But they're available, they're being viewed across the world. There's very few people who are doing the kind of work that I do. I don't work with individuals, but I still abide by confidentiality, and that's how I'm willing to do with our two guests.
Thank you, Rich.
You're
Thank
quite
you.
welcome.
So in Carol's book, and then when you and I spoke, Rich, there seemed to be some connection for those who suffer significantly. And I know these words sometimes are just not the right words, but relative to anything with PTSD. But those who suffer severely, like Carol's father did immediately after the war, versus those who did not, there seems to be some predisposition to this, right? You and I talked about it, Rich. You called it pre-morbid diagnoses, I think it was. Carol, in your book, you did some research and you seem to come to what conclusion about your father?
Well, I wrote another book because it's called Twisted Strands, Family Secrets and Intergenerational Trauma. Because my father found out when he was late 40s that he wasn't the biological son of his dad, and he never knew that. My grandpa Schultz had married my grandmom when she was 7 months pregnant with another man's child, my uncle, my father's younger brother, had worked at the VA and saw that my grandmother had been an Army nurse in World War I and saw the records that my grandmother had been married before and hadn't divorced her first husband until, golly, maybe she was 2 months pregnant with my dad. So my dad then started searching for this first husband. He found some of the family. He basically went to meet the family. They hadn't seen this man Sherman for like 40 years, but they welcomed my dad with open arms. And so I joined Ancestry and started to, get various matches, and none of them happened to be the first husband or my grandpop, the second husband. And it turned out that my father's biological father was somebody totally different. And so this put me this is after my dad was gone, put me down the rabbit hole in terms of, well, he was sort of lied to during his childhood. Not that my grandfather was a World War I Marine. He was wonderful to my dad. He had 3 children after there were his biological children. You would have never known.
Yeah.
And if the brother hadn't told my dad, but I think the brother wanted to sort of get back at my dad because my grandmother was so obviously favored by father. So I think that was sort of the thing in his childhood. He was basically living a lie. They were lying to him.
Oh, I could tell you about my family ghosts and skeletons, but I will not bore you. Again, I think these are very precious private situations. And if the two of you, our guests, are interested, I would. I mean, no charge. I don't charge people anymore.
Yeah, no, I've been going to therapy for like 25, 30 years. I also...
Well, okay, so what therapist are you seeing? Because that's a long time.
No, off and on. Not complete, not the same.
I mean, if you're seeing a psychoanalyst, then that's not good.
I didn't have that.
I mean, if they want to prescribe you all these medications.
No, I'm not.
We'll let the 2 of you talk about that offline, but.
Okay.
No, I'm off and on because not only did I have the trauma of what happened with my mom and dad, but my only sibling died at 22. And a lot of that, lot of what was going on in our family contributed to that, some of her poor choices in men. And so I've had to deal with a lot of these things, and I haven't gone to therapy continuously, but I recently found a therapist that specializes in secondary traumatization.
Good.
And it's been very helpful.
I bet you it is.
Yeah, to talk to
If I provide the 2 of you any consultation, it's private, confidential. I don't,
We need to move on to another question because I've seen Sue Watson has had her hand up for quite some time. Sue, I think you're unmuted.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes, we can.
Yeah, I just had some quick thoughts. I know we're beyond time, and it comes from some of my work with veterans, but mostly my dad. And I think there's one factor, and that's capacity. When we talk about PTSD and how things affect people, my dad had a very unusual childhood where he lost his mother young, grew up in an orphanage, some of those kind of things. And so I think he went, with maybe a different capacity. And we all have, a cup maybe of, how we deal with our traumas. But with my dad in particular, and Todd is very aware of 2 stories that I think really helped my dad. My mother also helped my dad. She probably would not have allowed PTSD. If you knew my mother, you would know that that's probably true. But 2 things happened to him while he was still on Iwo Jima, and one was a very abbreviated story. He was in hand-to-hand combat, knew he had to get up or, lose his life, got up and stood face to face with a Japanese soldier, and both of them looked at one another and turned and walked away. And I think that was a hugely healing part of his experience. And the other is a story that Todd brought out of my father, and it's been recorded, fondly known as the bayonet story. And, before he left Iwo Jima, he looked down and saw his grizzled bayonet and tried to clean it in the sand, and decided instead to just leave it in the sand, and picked up another one. And I really think that those two things were, obviously not planned, but I think that they helped him deal and heal. I wish that everybody had experienced. I think there have been some stories either on this program or other stories, similar, where people didn't have to follow commands, but made a decision, coming face to face with the enemy and turning and walking away. And I think, you can't go back and do that, but I think that certainly helped my dad hold on to things when it got tough. And he couldn't always hold it together. But anyway, thanks for letting me share that.
Yeah.
And
Thank
can
you.
I respond to
I
that?
have a story to tell.
Carol and Susan both have some comments. Go
I
ahead,
just
Carol.
wanted to say my father had a similar experience where he was jumped into a foxhole, and there was a young German soldier in there. He said he was probably about 16. And they both looked at each other, had guns, and the young soldier lowered his gun. And my dad lowered his gun, and he let him walk away. And my dad said at that moment, he thought, what's the matter with me? I'm taught to kill. But he said later on, he realized he kept his humanity.
Right.
So I think that's what Sue was saying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What I want to share is that my father heard there was an explosion in a building, and Daddy heard somebody screaming out. Glenn knows the story, screaming out in pain. And my father ran into the building thinking it was one of our soldiers, and it was a young German soldier, Dad's age, and he was bleeding out and in really bad shape, and he was holding up his picture of his wife and two little kids. And my father thought to himself, maybe he's not a Nazi, maybe he got drafted, maybe he doesn't know about the camps. And my father gave him morphine and bandaged him up and saved his life. And then Dad got down low and looked this German soldier in the eyes and said to him in Yiddish, never forget a Jew saved your life.
Wow.
Yeah, wow. That's who Bernie was.
I see Al Smith has his hand up. I'm unmuting you, Al. Al?
Yeah, yes, it seems only fitting as we talk about PTSD and whatever. Maybe it goes without saying, but the Veteran Administration does a fabulous job with the best. And I have a good friend who was at the Ai Drang Valley in Vietnam, and a young guy. I mean, that was a horrific first major battle in Vietnam. And he said when he came home, he was really messed up, tried to commit suicide twice, and the VA saved his life. They knew what to do and help him, and he seems okay today, although certain things he can't get into a subway, for example, but he's living a normal life. So hail to the VA for what they're doing.
Yeah. From everything I've understood and read, I think Todd is agree with this. The VA does everything it can now to help these men. It's just so unfortunate that 80 years ago, there was nothing. There was nothing. And I suppose that's just the evolution of mankind, of human behavior now that we're finally trying to do something. Todd, I know you've dealt with this topic of PTSD an awful lot over the years. I just wonder here, we need to wrap this up. I don't want to put any pressure on you whatsoever, Todd, but do you have something profound to wrap this up with?
Are you going to show the monument? Are you going to show the monument?
I am, Susan.
Okay, let's wrap this up. I just want to point in the comments to something Eric Montgomery said, which I think was really insightful, and that is post-traumatic stress should be a reasonable response to trauma. And, I think for years it's been seen as a maladaptation. And maybe it's not. Maybe it's something that should be expected from exposure to trauma and something that can be worked through.
Do you think, though, Todd, that is anathema to the warrior doctrine that has to be taught at the basic training and, early entry level of men into the military so they can go out and do what the military demands they do?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's, I think it should be taught, but how it's taught, I have no idea how you do that. And then order a warrior to go and be exposed to the trauma that's going to hurt them for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it is an incredibly complex subject. I thank our guests, Carol and Susan tonight, and Rich for being on with us and sharing their stories. I want to make sure I thank our 2 World War II veterans. Russell, it's always a pleasure to have you on. Thank you for staying in touch with us. We appreciate all of your comments when you're on. And George, hopefully you're still on. Thank you so much for sharing your personal story about PTSD. Your inspiration, I'm sure, to a lot of younger men who have dealt with this just in the last couple decades. And thank you very much. So before we leave, I promised Susan I would show this, and so I am going to show this.
Thank you.
And let me get to it. So in last year, at the 80th anniversary of D-Day, the Atlantic City government came through and put this monument up where? Right in the middle of Atlantic City?
It's at O'Donnell Park. The World War I monument is behind it. And then it was 4 veterans. It was 2 generals, a Vietnam vet and an Iraq vet that would stand at bars with flags and try to raise money. It took us, Daddy died in 2018. And right after he died, there was a phone call to the head of the Philadelphia Inquirer. These guys, Fishers, wanted that they donate 1 monument a year to a hero. And this guy said it's Bernie Friedenberg for 2018, and Daddy had just died. And these guys raised money. The mayor gave us $460,000, and it turned out to be almost $2 million. And the Atlantic City Casino Commission kicked up with $160,000, and we unveiled it finally on D-Day last year for the 80th anniversary. And if you want, if you email me, I have all the news coverage of it. I have Governor Corzine interviewed my father, which was an amazing interview. And I would love to send anybody the information on that. And my father's famous quote is, "Freedom is not free. Freedom was bought and paid for with the blood and deaths of many young, brave men and women. Nothing is worth dying and fighting for, but freedom is." And that's what my father said, and it's on the monument. And with that very apt story and quote, I think we need to close this up. Thank you all for being with us tonight. Is just to make sure there's any last minute question. I don't want to miss anybody. I didn't see anybody. I scrolled through. Todd, Sean, you think we're done? Okay. Thank you all so very much. George, Russell, Carol, Susan, thank you. Kent or Rich, thank you all. Everybody have a good night. Thank you. God bless all of you.